To those who doubt that humans are driving the acceleration of planetary warming, of climate change, of our ability to change the nature of nature, get over it. Get over it. Wake up, realize, and then do what you can do, or at least don't get in the way.
While the climate has changed in the past, we are now seeing it alter at an unprecedented rate. In the last 2 decades alone, we've experienced 14 of the hottest 15 years on record, and we're to blame for it. Burning fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and natural gas to generate energy has the greatest impact on the atmosphere than any other single human activity. These greenhouse gases act like a blanket. The thicker the blanket, the warmer our planet becomes. Globally, power generation is responsible for 23 billion tons of CO2 emissions per year, in excess of 700 tons every second. At the same time, the Earth's oceans are also absorbing some of this extra carbon dioxide, making them more acidic and less hospitable for sea life. Sea levels are rising and oceans are becoming warmer. Longer, more intense droughts threaten crops, wildlife, and freshwater supplies. From polar bears in the Arctic to marine turtles off the coast of Africa, our planet's diversity of life is at risk from the changing climate. We know this. Scientific evidence for warming of the climate system is unequivocal. So why does progress seem to be at a standstill, and why does climate change continue to worsen? You may argue that it's because of unsustainably using carbon-emitting fossil fuels, methane gas emissions from livestock, pollution from industrial processes, or even deforestation of Earth's once plentiful rainforests. This is all true, but these are all held as a consequence of a greater universal problem that comes from a flaw in society where individuals are willing to use illicit means to maximize personal or corporate product. The heart of climate change is corruption. In the 2014 climate change report by the IPCC, CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion and industrial processes contributed to 78% of the total greenhouse gas emission increase between 1970 and 2010. So if corruption lies there with the oil and gas industry, with bribery and embezzlement going unchecked, the over-drilling of resources far more than what is legally allowed, and with payments made to governments to exploit resources remaining secret, then how are we ever going to be able to tackle climate change? We may all recognize the oil and gas industries of Shell and Eni, and if not, then by their symbols. This fame is worrying, however, because it shows the sheer extent of their influence and the great public unawareness of how their corruption directly impacts climate change. In 2011, the two companies purchased a potentially lucrative offshore tract called Opal 245 in the Atlantic Ocean off Nigeria for $1.3 billion. But the money never went to the public trust as it should have. Instead, nearly all of it went to Dan Etait, Nigeria's oil minister who was convicted of money laundering in France in 2007. Through Etait, much of the money is believed to have ended up being shared by high-ranking Nigerian government officials in a series of political kickbacks, so Shell fully aware. And good news, Shell and Eni are to go on trials of this corruption on March 8, 2018. Shell, Exxon, and most other major oil and gas companies knew decades ago that their products were fueling climate change. But instead of acting on that knowledge and changing their business model, they embarked on a massive campaign to deceive the public and lure policymakers into complacency. Not surprisingly, Shell is one of 47 major hydrocarbon producers now being investigated by the Filipino government in its role in contributing to human rights violations stemming from climate change. The corruption behind climate change isn't the only issue, however. We are dealing with this problem wrong, and this is due in large part to the corruption of government agencies worldwide. In 2016, the Paris Agreement marked a turning point in the battle against climate change. World leaders from across the globe united for the first time in history to legally ratify action against pollution through the United Nations Framework Convention. While this may be seen as a success, many signatories have displayed a remarkable lack of ambition in upholding their carbon reduction commitments. To understand why is to see the sheer extent to which our systems of government have been captured by the corrupting influence of vested interests. In the US's case especially, Trump backed out of this agreement after 22 senators wrote a letter to the president when he was said to be on the fence about backing out. They received more than $10 million from oil, gas, and coal companies the past 3 election cycles.
The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord.
With avid climate change deniers and conservative Republican officials who falsify scientific data like Donald Trump and Scott Pruitt running this country, progress is difficult to be made that isn't pushed aside and called a hoax.
I am not a believer in climate change.
Some of the most climate-vulnerable countries in the world fare worse on Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. The money intended to improve and save lives could be lost through corruption. This money is pledged by rich, carbon-emitting countries who have the greater share of responsibility in causing climate change to poorer, climate-vulnerable countries. For example, in 2011, Bangladesh set aside $3.1 million to build climate-resilient housing in the country's coastal southwest after Cyclone Aila gutted it. When researchers from Transparency International Bangladesh visited the site, they discovered homes built without walls. "I don't know whether it's built for human beings or not," said Khadija Begum about her house. It turns out the structures had been built exactly to Ministry of Disaster Management and Relief approved specifications. The government halved the cost to construct each house so it could take credit for building more houses. It's developed countries with the corruption that fuels climate change, which then breeds more corruption in less developed countries that need the most support. In the grand scheme of things, corruption is everywhere you look. Corruption of the logging industry in Peru aids cutting of the Amazon rainforest. Germany's Deutsche Bank, the 10th largest investor in coal, was found to secretly fund the Green Climate Fund, credited as being the most transparent fund established to assist developing countries counter climate change. That Florida gets offshore drilling exemption in protected waters, and that the Koch brothers sent at least $100 million from their vast oil profits to groups denying climate change to push a polluter agenda. This may seem all doom and gloom, but there is reason for hope. Despite Donald Trump's claim for withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement, we're seeing for the first time thousands of CEOs, college presidents, mayors, and governors are standing shoulder to shoulder declaring with one voice that America is still in. More than 300 companies around the world are setting targets to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions based on climate science. If we embrace solar and wind power to their full potential, we can cut the world's yearly carbon emissions by a third. Already, Germany produces 27% of its energy from renewables, with a goal of 80% by 2050. Denmark has shown it can produce more wind energy than it can use, and England is building the world's biggest offshore wind farm. Communities large and small are taking steps. A new public building in Mexico City has an exterior that breaks down air pollutants, erasing the effects of 1,000 cars each day. New innovations are making important strides possible, and more are on the way, but we can't wait. To sustain progress in the fight against climate change and corruption, environmental and anti-corruption movements will have to work together and play to their respective strengths.